Welcome to another episode of Tech Beyond Gender. I'm your host, Meena Satish Kumar, and today I'm thrilled to introduce a special guest, Camy. Camy's 14 years tech experience has spanned into two countries where she's held roles at consultancies, a startup, and some of New Zealand's largest banks. Since 2013, she has been a prominent figure in New Zealand's banking and fintech sectors. Beyond her impressive professional achievements, Camy has found her true passion in community building. She organizes Tech Conference in New Zealand alongside her day job, fostering connections and growth within the tech community. Camy is also a co-founder of NZ Tech Rally, an initiative that provides inclusive spaces for New Zealand's software community to come together and grow. Additionally, she runs a YouTube channel called Tech Engineering Lounge, where she shares her insights and experiences in the tech world. Camy, welcome to the show. We're excited to have you with us today.
Namaste, Meena. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is truly honored. I'm very honored to be here. And that was such an amazing intro. Thank you for that as well.
I just felt like I was talking about a superwoman who organizes conferences, who does this, runs a YouTube channel, and has a full-time job. How do you manage that?
Oh, can I just start with saying, and I mean, I've already told you this before we jumped on this call, but like everything that you're doing is just so cool. I actually heard your name so many times because we both work at BNZ, but I just didn't have a chance to reach out to you. And it was like it was in my list. Like I have to reach out to Meena because I'm always looking for people, especially women from similar background as me, who are doing all of this community building. So I'm really happy and grateful that this is finally happening, and like massive respect for everything that you're doing, and we need more women from our background doing these kind of things. So amazing work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Now, can you share a bit about your personal journey and how you ended up in New Zealand tech sector?
Yeah, I can start all the way back.
Yes, however long you
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I was born in the late 80s. So I'm a bit of a 90s kid. And I was born, I mean, I come from a lower middle class Indian family. And as we know, like lower middle class Indian family in India are actually very poor. So I do come from like millions of other Indians. I come from a very poor background, and also a highly patriarchal background, which is very common again for Indian families. So yeah, I was born in 90s. I've got two siblings. My mom was stay-at-home mom. My dad had almost 3 jobs. Mom was always sick and we were poor, so dad had to provide for us, and the biggest thing that me and my sister had going on for us when we were kids was that our parents were progressive enough to send us to private school. So even though it was a low-cost private school, but that was pretty much like 60 to 70% of my dad's salary, which is why he had 3 jobs. So it was hard. Like growing up, it was hard, and I have massive respect for my dad. Like he is one of the biggest role models and one of the most amazing masculine influences on my life. And I think like I am almost like 70 to 80% of my genes are from my dad. Like I am highly ambitious, I'm a bit hardworking, I'm stoic, and I think a lot of that comes from my dad. Yeah, so I like, especially being a girl, like options for me and my sister were very limited growing up. At that time, also, like when I was growing up in the late 80s, 90s, like dowry debts were very common, if you know what that is. So for our listeners, it's in India, because it's a patriarchal culture, a woman's worth comes from being married. So once you're 18, it is very important for you to get married. But when you get married away, the bride's family has to pay a lot of money to the groom's family, and that's called dowry. And at that time, if you do not bring dowry, the in-laws would just kill you. And it was very ugly. Like that's the culture that my parents grew up in. I believe post-independent India, like 60s, 17, 80s, that was very bad. So my parents were very aware of that. And so for them, educating their girl children was very important. And because we, like, the entire neighborhood where we grew up was very poor. All the guys went to private schools, and the girls, like, people would send their girls to public schools. So like we were the only family that where the girls were being sent to private school. So like for my parents, that was highly progressive, very bold, and everyone in the neighborhood would tell my parents that, why are you wasting your money on your daughters? Why don't you just send them to public schools? And I think for my parents, because they were heavily influenced by that dowry culture, they were like our girls, like we want to educate our girls so that we don't have to give dowry. They will become doctors and engineers and they will just provide for themselves. And like 30 years from now, 30 years from then, looking at me and my sister, we are providing for ourselves, we provide for our families, and it's just like it has almost come true. So like massive props to my parents, like the time and place they were born in, they were highly progressive for their time. So, but even like growing up, even though we went to like private school, our options were still very limited. It was like you either become a doctor or engineer or you get married away. If you like after you graduate high school, if you cannot get through to becoming a doctor or engineer, you just have to get married away because like that's how you survive in that culture. So I didn't want to get married away at 18. So I worked hard and I got into a local engineering college where I did a 4-year engineering degree. And then I graduated. And 6 months later, after I graduated, I got into Infosys. And that was one of the biggest breaks I've had in my career because for all our Indian listeners, you would already know how massive Infosys is or used to be back in like early 2000s, 2010. So yeah, in 2010 or 2011, I joined Infosys and I was very lucky. I was only with Infosys for about 2.5 years when an opportunity to work for Westpac arrived. So in 2013, I packed my bags and I left my family, and I had a boyfriend at that time. I left everything behind and moved to New Zealand in 2013. It was a short-term opportunity, but once I landed here, I just loved it. Like I just felt like home. I think you always know where home is. I think my entire life I was looking for home. I never felt home in my home country, but once I landed in Wellington, I just knew Wellington is home. So then 8 months later, or about a year later, I switched to ANZ, and then I was there at ANZ for about 5 years. And at my so my career progressed at ANZ and I ended up becoming a team lead. But then once I became a team lead, 18 months into that role, I realized that this sucks. Middle management, especially the bottom of middle management, totally sucks. And it's like for a lot of people, you don't realize it until you get there. So at that time, I decided to get out of middle management and go back to being a senior QI, senior IC. And I moved to contracting. So during all that time in New Zealand, those 5 or 6 years in New Zealand, I also ended up buying a house for myself. And because when I bought my house, the mortgages were small, for some reason, I was kind of like, okay, I want to be able to pay off this mortgage in the next 6 or 7 years. So I moved to contracting, and then one contract led to another contract. And I mean, I've been in and out of BNZ a couple of times now. I'm still contracting at BNZ. Like this is my 3rd year in a row at BNZ now, second contract. Yeah, and then last year I just finished paying off my mortgage and I'm still contracting. But like all of that time I was contracting, I was kind of like, okay, I have already figured out that climbing a corporate ladder is not for me. That does not bring me joy. So what brings me joy? So just like you, I also started podcasting. I started creating YouTube videos. One of my colleagues and my very dear friends, Fabio, at that time, he always had this vision that he wanted to organize a conference. So he shared that vision with me. And then we kept on talking about it. And then 6 months later, we ended up organizing our first conference, which was the first edition of New Zealand Testing Conference. And it just turned out to be very amazing. Actually, it had to be postponed due to COVID. But then when it actually happened in 2022, it was a sold out event. And it was like everyone was so impressed that we were able to pull it off. And I think that's where I found my true calling, that I really love community building for all the right reasons. And I think building my career as someone from a marginalized background in New Zealand, like over that time had heavily influenced me. Because for me, I never had any role models that looked like me or that have a same, like they have similar background as me with Indian surname, Asian surname. When I arrived in New Zealand back in 2013, there were hardly any women in technical roles. I remember, I think I was probably the only one, or maybe only two. Um, there were no female developers. There were no female technical leads. Now we have so many, which is so cool to see. But back when I was there, everyone was just busy complaining about the pipeline problem. Like a lot of work has been done to solve the pipeline problem since then. Like amazing organizations like Summer of Tech, the Academy, they've done amazing jobs, and now we see a lot of youngsters, a lot of young women, also a lot of migrant women in tech in technical roles now. But back when I was starting, there was no one. There were no role models. Most of the women who were there and around me were in non-technical roles, and a lot of them were non-Indian, or I mean, they were mostly white. There were no women of color, because women of color, the intersectionality is massive, right? Like you could be Asian, you could be Indian, you could be Hispanic, you could be Maori and Pacifica, and it's a shame that none of them were there. So for me, I always felt quite disconnected, and all of that just led me to organizing conferences and then finally launching NZ Tech Rally. And NZ Tech Rally provides inclusive spaces for New Zealand software community to come and grow together. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is baked into it. Like the way we organize our conferences. If you go check us out on YouTube, our channel is called NZ Tech Rally. We upload all of our videos from all of our conferences on YouTube. And if you look at our talks, you can tell straight off our talks are highly inclusive. You can see that we spend a lot of time on representation for speakers, because you will find on our channel that you will see speakers from all backgrounds. So yeah, that's it's a very long there's a very long intro, very long background, but that's it. Like it's been I feel like it's been a very long journey, probably like 50,000 miles from where I was born, from where my parents come, because my parents grew up in rural areas. They were the first ones in their families to move to small towns. And I was born in a very small town in North India, and from there to be a company founder today, to own a house, pay off the mortgage. I guess that's a lot. So I feel like I don't get a lot of opportunities to share about my personal experience. So I really, really appreciate that. I think majority of people, like when you apply for a job, or you go for an interview, they just look at your CV and they look at the number of years you have spent in tech and your technical skills, or whether you are a culture fit. They never go anything beyond like where did you go college to? Where is your background from? What were your parents like? What were you like a kid? Like no one does it. So I feel like they always miss out on the amount of distance that certain people have covered. And I think that's very common for people of color or women of color, because a lot of people of color are living in third world countries or developing countries, and life is incredibly hard there. Like being a poor person in a country like India or in a Middle East country or in Africa is just way different than being poor in a first world country. So I hope that makes sense.
Wow, that's amazing. Like, wow, what a journey. I just can't imagine the resilience you have demonstrated. And it's not easy, and not many women would be confident enough to go contracting, right? And especially if you have a mortgage.
Yeah.
I've come across many women who say like, oh my God, I have a mortgage. I cannot afford to go contracting. I need job security. But brave, you have been so brave to just.
I do have a higher risk appetite than majority of people. I'm also neurodiverse. Like I'm autistic with ADHD. So I think very differently, and I look at the world very differently. And like, I'm just bold. I just like that. So that's an adjective that a lot of my friends will use. That boldness sometimes can be dumb and stupid, but in a lot of times, I think a lot of majority of the times it has worked in my own favor. I managed to contract throughout COVID. Like people were getting, all my friends and my colleagues, even at BNZ, where like, contracts were being cut. Redundancies. Like I've managed to contract throughout COVID, throughout the aftermath of COVID. And I think that also goes back to being very smart with your career planning, which we can talk about later because I know you've got some of those questions too.
Yeah. So, what were the initial challenges you faced moving to New Zealand, starting your work in Westpac? How was it for you?
Yeah. I guess one of the biggest differences was the cultural difference, like growing up in an Eastern culture and then moving to a Western culture. It's drastically different. A lot of people do not realize it. Like India is very different from any of the first world countries. China is very different. And I think a lot of people who live here won't realize it until they go spend 3 months in India or 3 months in Japan. I think that the cultural difference, it messes up your head. So like the first 6 months to 1 year, you are just living in culture shock, even though this environment is much more friendly, much more gender friendly, much more women friendly. I have way more freedom here, but it's a massive difference. Also, like having no family. I had no family. I had no one related to me by blood or by marriage. And on this continent, when I moved here, I'm very lucky. My sister moved here last year, so now finally I have family in the country. At that time, like all the first 10 years of me being in New Zealand, I had no family. And the first year, it was very hard because my boyfriend was also in India at that time, and my family was there. Like I knew no one in New Zealand, just apart from one of my really close friends who had just arrived in New Zealand 3 months before me. She was the only person I knew. So I had to figure out everything. And, like I still remember, like Indian girls, we grow up with so much brainwashing that we are girls. Like from the moment we are born, we are brainwashed to believe that we are girls and our opportunities are so limited and we cannot do this, we cannot do that, we cannot go for this. Like we are told to live in our shells and never come out of our shell. So coming to New Zealand with all of that programming in my head, it was incredibly hard. Language, even though I started learning English at a very young age, but I spoke Indian English. I didn't speak New Zealand English, and Indian English is very different to New Zealand English. So even when I was speaking, it sounded like we are still talking in English, but it was different languages. And anytime I would speak, people would be like, sorry, what? Can you repeat that? It's- and I know I've discussed that with so many of my migrant friends from non-native English backgrounds. And with English now, it's like a lot of countries people speak English, but every country, every culture has their own version of English, kind of like Indian English, like South American English, like French English. So yeah, I think English not being my native language, like Hindi is my native language. And even though I started learning English at a very young age, like we just speak in Hindi, so we are much more fluent in Hindi. Like I would only speak in English at my school or at work. Outside that, you don't speak English, so you think you're fluent according to the Indian standards, but according to New Zealand standards, you're not fluent. So yeah, I think English was one of the biggest problems, and I think one of the struggles for a lot of migrant employees is that our visas are tied to our employers. Like my visa was tied to the employers for almost about 3 to 4 years. And that is not a good situation to be in. My first employer, no, I think the employers were always great, but the managers weren't that great. The managers who were managing me weren't that great. So I think a lot of time those managers would use that visa as a leverage. The company didn't know about it because if the company found out about that, they would freaking fire them. But the thing is, but that's how middle management works, right? Like the certain people, certain companies have like their own culture, like companies had a company culture. I guess I just ended up in one of those companies. The managers weren't just that great; they were a bit toxic. So, but I couldn't leave, because my visa is tied. Now the only option is to go back to India, where I came from, and I have worked so hard to be here. Yeah, so like I think that was hard just having that. So I was just waiting so eagerly to get my residency, and then I think after a year I got my residency, I switched to contracting, and that was amazing. Yeah, so I guess like adjusting to two very different worlds in a very short amount of time, language being a big barrier, not having any family, no support at all. I guess it was very hard. I think there were times where I was clearly depressed, but one thing I learned from my dad is just you just keep going. You just like hard work always pays off, and you just keep going. So I think that's just what I did. Yeah.
There was one thing you mentioned about how we grow up with this conditioning, right, in India
Mm,
about this is how a woman behaves and this is how a man
mm,
behaves, sort of. I think in India it is very pronounced and clear. There is no gray area. It is all black
mm,
and white. You are a
mm,
woman, you do this. You're a man, you do this. But
yeah.
I feel in here it is a little bit more subtle.
Mm,
Because when I soon after I moved here, I was living with my godparents who were Kiwis,
mm,
and certain behaviors were similar. Like my godmother was also working, and my godfather was working. They would come back from work in the evening, and my godfather would levitate more towards the TV and the living room, whereas the godmother would be in the kitchen busy preparing dinner and
yeah.
clearing the dishes. And yeah, so it was a little bit more subtle.
Mm,
It was not very much on your face, but there were
mm,
certain cultural or like stereotypical gender
mm,
stereotypical behaviors that were sort of ingrained.
mm,
And I was last year when I was doing the research, I was talking to one woman who was a recent graduate. And I was talking to her about her experience working in this sector and how it was studying at university, doing a technical paper. She said in university, with the technical projects that she had to do, the men would actually do the actual real technical work, whereas the women were expected to provide admin support for the project.
mm.
And it was just taken for granted. And she told me that working now feels much better than my life in university.
Yeah.
And I was like quite shocked, like even at this day and age, certain stereotype behaviors, right?
Yeah.
And another woman was sharing a story which happened to her at school about 10 years ago. It was a technical paper at school, there was a test, and she finished the test. She was quite comfortable with it. She finished it quite earlier than the due time, and she went with a completed paper to her teacher. And her teacher looked at her and said, "Are you sure you finished it?" And she was like, "Yes, I have finished it." She was like, "Are you sure the boys are still working on it?"
Yeah. Oh
And I
wow.
was like, and yeah, so I feel like one thing for me, like even I come from
Mm,
India, I feel the only difference is in New Zealand, I feel it's a little bit more subtle. Whereas in India, when I go back, it's just on your face. And there is this constant reminder the whole time, hey, you are a woman and this is the boundary for you, right?
yeah, no, 100%. I mean, like growing up in India, I think it's that entire set, and again, like any other patriarchal system, right? Like any other patriarchal society, that those societies are not set up for women to succeed. Those societies are set up for women to stay home and have children and raise children, right? Like in our culture specifically, a women's worth comes from being married, B, having kids. If you don't have either of those, then it's almost a social taboo for the family, right? And I know Kirti and you discussed this in your last episode as well. Like, doesn't matter that I am a company founder, I am almost a millionaire, self-made millionaire now in New Zealand. I have two homes. It doesn't matter the fact that I'm not married matters way more, and people just focus on that rather than the like the 50,000 miles I have covered in my life, the resilience I have built, and the number of people I help. So I guess that is hard. But also, like, going back to your point around patriarchy and all those things being, like, all those symptoms of patriarchy being quite subtle in New Zealand, I think that definitely happens. Though I've noticed that, again, like, because we grew up in India, right? So, like, our experience of patriarchy is much more severe than people in New Zealand or first world countries, because they've gone through all those waves of feminism, like the feminist movement. Whereas in India, it was almost like, if I was to compare for any New Zealand listeners, from my experience of, like, watching movies and stuff, and like, it's like, what for me growing up as a woman in the 90s in India was pretty much like what in New Zealand would have been for women in, like, early 1900s. Like, that's the gap. So, and a lot of people do not realize that. And when I share stories from my own childhood with people of growing up in India, they almost emotionally disconnect, because they cannot even understand. They cannot even scratch the surface of what I'm saying, because that's just not their lived experience. Going back to what you were saying, it's so common, right? So even in offices, people always expect, and I think Kirti in the last episode also alluded to that. People expect, like, all the morning teas are always organized by females. Why? I usually don't raise my hand for organizing morning teas. No, I'm not going to do that. For my own company, yes, I will do it, because I'm a company founder. I want to be the CEO of my own company, so I will do it. I care about my employees. But for someone else's company, I'm not going to do it. And the thing is, like, more and more women do it, we set that precedent, and then people expect you to do it. So in a way, we are also setting ourselves up for failure. One of the things that I have heard from some of my girlfriends is they get spoken over all the times by their male colleagues. And no one speaks over me. I think in early years of my career, probably people did, but I've always been kind of like outspoken, and I mean, bold is my main personality describer anyway. So people usually don't speak over me. If people do, I always correct them. I will always cut them off. And I'm always very polite when I do that. I will always very politely kind of like put them in their place and make sure they do not repeat it. But a lot of my female friends, that happens to them. And I think that happens to them because they're just very nice, polite, and soft-spoken people. And then I started noticing that actually also happens to a lot of guys and a lot of gender diverse people. And I think that's just one of the things, like anyone who is a little bit macho at work or a little bit more masculine at work will just talk over. And often it happens to women. So yeah, like that is another thing that I've noticed again and again that happens. Also kind of like, it's so hard, right? So like when I started, as I was saying earlier, when I started in banking, there were hardly any technical, hardly any females in technical roles. There were hardly any, like there were absolutely no gender diverse individuals. Hardly any women of color. I would find myself in meetings where I am the only woman. I'm not only the only person of color, but I'm also the only woman in the room. Everyone else in the room is a white male. And majority of my colleagues have been my allies right from the start of my career. So when I say these things with like utmost respect, but there is also that sense of privilege there, like white males do happen to be the most privileged section of the society. And I think tech is dominated by white males. And that's exactly that is what was my lived experience when I first started, especially in banking. Technical roles, senior technical roles and banking were mostly white males. And a white male's experience in comparison to like a white male who grew up in a first world country to me, a woman of color who grew up in a highly patriarchal country, is very, very different, very different. So I used to feel very, very excluded, which is the opposite of being inclusive, right? And those are all the reasons why I started NZ Tech Rally, like my own personal motivations. And the thing, and when I share this story, I don't share it from the sense that they did anything to me. They did nothing. They are all very, very lovely people. Most of them are still my friends. They have been some of my strongest allies. But because there were no role models, there was no representation. I still felt excluded. And I think that's what happens, right? Like people of color or women, the minority groups will always notice if there is no one like them, whereas the majority groups will not notice. In India, I didn't used to notice any of these things because everyone's Indian. Even though Indians, and like how Indians vary, because India is a massive country, we vary so much in skin color. There was never that much focus on skin color because everyone is Indian. We all speak the same language. Whereas in New Zealand, you actually see that. And I think it's not just the skin color and the race, but there is like so much massive cultural difference as well. So yeah, hope that makes sense.
Yeah, the other day I was in a networking meeting with few women, and one woman was sharing her experience. A few years ago, she was in construction industry, and she was actually in the management leadership team. But she went into a meeting. She was the only female there, and people in that meeting just assumed that she is a secretary of another male colleague or a receptionist. And they were like, okay, can you get some beverages for us, coffee for us, please? And another woman shared a similar experience, and the way they got around it was making the worst cup of coffee or tea with way too much sugar, way too much coffee, and that they would never ask them again. So they were sharing their secret tips on how to put men off from that behavior completely. So the next time when they want a cup of coffee or tea, they actually stop and think,
Yeah.
better for me to go and get my own cup of coffee or tea.
And I often wonder, right? Kind of like, because I mean, I grew up in a patriarchal country, but my dad was not a patriarch. My mom was usually sick growing up. She was very sick. My dad had 3 jobs, and he would come home and he would still make dinner for us. And he would get up at 4 a.m. every day in the morning, and from 6 a.m. onwards, he would make breakfast and lunch for us. Like I had such a great role model. So for me, any time when I kind of like get into my deep thoughts around how patriarchy sucks, I think I always think of my dad. Like there are men like my dad, who in a severely patriarchal world, still they were not patriarchs. Like, because for my dad, he just had his own philosophy, and he lives life through his own philosophy, and in his own philosophy, everyone is equal. His girl, and like it doesn't matter the gender of his children, right? They are my children. I love them to like they are above everything in this world. I love them so much. So I think for me, I just go back to kind of like how my dad used to treat us.
So one more thing which really struck to me is about how you explained you had some male colleagues who were real allies who supported you in the initial stages of your career, right? So, and you just described it really well. Like there are people with whom we work who come from a really privileged background, right? They have access to things more easily than us. And especially us coming from India, you are great, Camy. Like you have high confidence, your confidence level is really good and stuff. But to be honest, my confidence level wasn't that great even when I came here, because I once again grew up in a family where it was very clearly like ingrained, brainwashed that I'm a woman and these are my boundaries and this is how I live my life. It was very clearly that message came across. So coming from that background, so you're already considered to be an inferior in a society, right, in India. And then coming from that background to a place like New Zealand, you are working alongside people who have experienced a lot of privileges all their lives, right? Now, I always used to think that, hey, like when we, and like someone like me who's come from that background with a bit of low confidence and shyness because of the language differences and stuff. Me coming here and attending, getting into an interview for a job and trying to compete with another person who's experienced only privilege all his
Mm,
life, it just becomes very unfair playing ground, I feel.
mm,
Because especially if you start looking at different technical roles, right? You said there are many women who you see in technical roles these days, especially in testing, tech
mm,
BA roles, and even in development or engineering roles. But when it comes to senior sort of technical roles and stuff, you start to see this leaky pipe where the number of women just decrease substantially. You don't really see many senior women like roles in
mm,
infrastructure or security domain or network domain within the technology sector, right? I
mm,
just even here, for instance, certain things are like roles and knowledge around subject areas are also stereotyped. So I just often feel that when we are getting into a job interview with all that in our mind, and if we have to go through the same process as how a man does,
mm.
is it a level playing field? Like, I just find it too
Yeah,
hard always to actually see what can be changed, what do we need to change, what can be done.
yeah. It is. I truly believe it is not a level playing field. Um, and that goes back to the concept of like it's everyone should have an equal opportunity, but then if you are competing, if you or I are competing against uh, even Indian men grow up so highly privileged in comparison to us, right? My brother was so freaking highly privileged in comparison to me. Now, applying for the same job, is it a playing level field? Absolutely not. Do we have an equal opportunity for the job? Yes. But have we, given our past experiences and the lives that we have lived and where we come from, is it fair? No. Um, and that's the sad part. And this is one of the reasons why I almost gave up climbing up the corporate ladder in New Zealand. It's like, no, because I'm going to compete. I'm going to have to compete, or I'm going to have to enter into interview rounds with people who are far more privileged than me. They grew up in New Zealand. They've never even left New Zealand. Their entire lives are in New Zealand. They've likely been working at the same company for several years. They went to school in Wellington. They have a job in Wellington and all of those things. And these might be very, very hardworking people and all of that stuff. But where I come from, the miles that I have covered, it's not fair. So that was one of the reasons I think, and there was one of the points in my life where I decided I am far off better building my own company with my own values that reflects who I am, my identity, rather than trying to be in climbing up the corporate ladder, especially in middle management in someone else's company. Not everyone has to do that. What I am doing is highly risky, takes all of you. I mean, you are on the same path now, so kudos to you. But yeah, no, it is not. And this is why podcasts like these, like talking about these topics, helps create awareness. And I hope there are hiring managers who will listen to this podcast and who will realize that when you see a migrant women of color's CV, don't just look at the experience of what you see on the paper. Also get to know their background, where they have come from, because the chances are if they've come from a country like Syria, they've come from Pakistan or from Middle East or from Africa, they had to fight really, really hard to even be in the CV pool. These are people, they are not only survivors of those highly patriarchal societies and cultures. These are the top 1% candidates over here. Like people don't realize, like my first job was at Infosys. Infosys is like everyone who works at Infosys is like almost the top 10% of the college graduates, like who are very high performing. They don't like people do not realize that, right? Like a lot of people in New Zealand or in first world countries do not realize that, like how highly competitive it is in India. And I think because like New Zealand in a way has like has a culture of like being average. Like, I've heard that talk so many other people talk about so many times, and I won't hesitate to say it, right? Because I'm Indian. I grew up in such a highly competitive culture, which is why I'm so highly ambitious, and that is something I am very proud of. I want more in my life. Why not? Being a woman, I was brainwashed to never want more, and now finally I have earned my way to more. So I want everything in this life, and I'm not going to hold back. And that's my message to all of the women from my culture or from similar cultures, or from anyone who's never had more growing up. Being poor absolutely sucks. Being poor is so shit. People don't realize it. Like people who come from privileged families, like my kids, when they are born, they will be highly privileged to where I come from. Like for me, growing up, bread was a luxury. A loaf of bread was a luxury, like because like everyone in the neighborhood couldn't afford bread. Like soft drinks was a luxury. Buying paneer was a luxury. My father's third job was to grow his own food, so that they didn't have to had that he doesn't have to put his money from his salary to buying groceries, because my parents come from rural families. They had agricultural land. So on top of the two jobs where my father would get money for exchange for his services, then over the weekends he would go and he would grow his own food. That was my father's third job, and that's how they saved money. So like I come from such poor background, so it's like how can you not want more? Like so, yeah.
So I was talking to a migrant woman last week, and she is an aspiring CIO, and she so wants to get into the top leadership roles, right? And so she was saying she's been looking at the ads and stuff, seeing okay what sort of requirement they're looking for. And in most roles that she has come across, they explicitly say you need to have been a CIO for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, right, 10 years ago too, even in technical roles, you didn't see many women. And can you imagine leadership roles, how many women we would have seen, right? And now getting into a CIO role,
Yeah.
expectation is you should have had 10 years of experience. Obviously, someone else with better privilege would be grabbing that opportunity than a woman, right? So, yes, once again, looking back at the opportunities, it's just hard.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I'll just, again, I have a similar story. So like, because I had given up climbing up the corporate ladder for a while now, but then through some conversations with some of my close girlfriends, I was kind of like, okay, I will see if I can get into an engineering manager role. And for the last couple of years, because now I've paid off the mortgage, I was like, okay, I can maybe for a few years, the next 5 years, I can switch to a permanent role. So I was like, okay, an engineering manager equivalent role would probably be a good fit for my career, because I was already an engineering lead back in 2019 when I left it. And if I had stayed on to my permanent job at ANZ, I'd probably at least be an engineering manager by now, right? So I was like, okay, maybe an engineering manager is a good role. So I have been applying for engineering manager roles for the last 2 years, and I haven't even gotten an interview, like a screening. Like I am cut off from the screening. And every time I always go back and I ask for feedback, like, hey, can you please tell me, what can I do? Like, why did my application didn't get selected, or what can I do? Majority of people or hiring managers or recruiters won't bother giving any feedback, wouldn't even reply back. And some of them who reply back will say that you do not have direct report experience. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, there are hardly any women in technical roles anyway. There are hardly any women in senior technical roles anyway. So for me to have prior experience of direct reports, like, how is that going to happen? And one of my really good friends, who is already an engineering manager at BNZ, she keeps on encouraging me, and she keeps on saying to me, if no one ever gives it to you, then how are you gonna get it? And I'm like, that's the exact same problem. Like, but they don't get it. Right? They don't get it. So, and now who am I competing with now? So those, who are those roles going to? Probably males, those roles are not going to other women from my background, or even to gender diverse individuals, because again, they don't exist. Those roles are probably going to the more privileged sections of the society, you know. So I like at this year, at the start of this year, after going through all of that, I was like, okay, this reinforces my belief of how everyone talks about equal opportunity, but that's where the conversation stops. No one is bothering to dig any further and do more about it. DEI is usually a tick box, you know, a checkbox ticking exercise for majority of the organizations. So that just reinforced my belief in how the system is biased and how it makes more sense for me to keep working at NZ Tech Rally and just keep working on my own initiatives that I'm working on right now.
Yeah, what you said was just perfect. Like a lot of the times it's easy to have DNI initiatives as a tick box, as a check box, and not many women are even encouraged to speak out,
Yeah.
right? Like hats off to people like Kirti and yourself who are just so comfortable to share your own genuine experience. Whereas many women actually are like so nervous to speak out. They are like, oh my God, it'll have a really bad impact on my career. One person was like, oh my God, I'm definitely not going to do this because I'm a contractor. And what if I need to find another contracting role? I will probably not get one. So it's like the self-silencing is very common. Like we tend to touch on topic that is very comfortable to talk on, right? Like it's easier to just say, hey, we need to work on increasing more women in the sector. Okay, so let's go to schools, let's go to universities, let's bring them in. But you're actually bringing them into a culture which is not mature enough to handle so many women talent in the sector, right? So it's like literally just having this huge elephant in a room and you just don't want to address it, right? Like anywhere you go, in most meetups and stuff, the real issues are not being really spoken about. It is everyone is comfortable to talk about things which they know will not get them into a trouble, literally.
Yeah, no, 100%. And one of the key indicators when people do talk, when organizations talk about DNI and they publish DNI reports, one of the things that I always look out for and I am interested is in give me more detailed metrics of how much women representation and how much intersectionality within women, within like women in tech do you have. So, and I think majority of the DNI stats, they just stop at like, okay, 46% of our workforce is now women. But no one will go further into those stats. Because if you are to go further into those stats, you will find that of that 46% of women workforce, almost 35% are white women. And the remaining percent is now Asian, Indian, Maori Pacifica, African, Black women, Hispanic, like all the other sections, right? No one talks about it. I'm like, tell me how many of your women are women, how many engineering leads that you actually have, how many engineering managers do you have that are women, how many senior leaders, how many executive leaders are women, and gender diverse individuals, and what ethnicities are they from? Like, but no one talks about it. And I think large enterprises are absolutely notorious for that. Like they usually do not lead by example. I think because I've worked in the startup space, and I do have a lot of contacts in the startup space just through my work at NZ Tech Rally and organizing conferences. I think in the startup scene, it's very common for the senior LTs to actually focus on these metrics, but large enterprises do not talk about it. Why not? Maybe because they know that's where they need to do a lot of work. And yeah, it's a shame. But when people say we have DNI initiatives and like we are doing all of these things and 46% of our population is women, I'm like, tell me how many Maori Pacifica women do you have? Tell me how many Asian women do you have? Tell me how many gender diverse individuals you have? Because that's what I'm interested in. Because those are the people in the society who still feel excluded, right? So yeah.
Yeah. So, what sort of biases have you personally experienced in New Zealand, and how did you navigate through them?
Hmm. I guess I haven't experienced that many biases in New Zealand itself. I think New Zealand is a much more aware culture in comparison to, because I have friends who are in states. States is pretty shit, and like their work culture is pretty shit, right? Um, New Zealand in general, I feel, at least in my experience, it's very progressive. And again, I grew up in India, so my bar is kind of like, I mean, it's bad to say, but it is low because I mean, my early childhood, the first quarter of my life was the experiences were so severe that there are very few places in this world that can top it. So actually, my experience in New Zealand has been quite opposite to what I experienced in India. I experienced far more discrimination and far more biases in India, like millions of other Indian women. In New Zealand, my biggest struggle has been lack of role models. And this is where I think a lot of work that I do, especially through the conferences and NZ Tech Rally, is about creating a platform that provides role models to all sections of the society, especially for marginalized communities. Yeah, because like, and I think because I never had that, I growing up in all because I moved to New Zealand when I was 25. So over the last 11 years, I have never been able to look up to like a female CTO, and I'm like, man, she's had Indian background, and heads off to her, and I want to be like her. No, most of those women are Kiwis and they are white. And kudos to them, they've had their own struggles, and I know at like because the system is rigged, it's still highly patriarchal. They had their own fights to fight. And there is this phrase, right? Like the ceiling is of glass, like the glass ceiling. That's for white women. But for women of color, the ceiling is concrete. It is literally concrete because and again, imposter syndrome in women of color is way worse because it's combined with a lifetime of brainwashing, of adhering to those very rigid constructs that we were born into. Whereas a lot of people, I mean, my kids wouldn't have to do that, right? They like the moment they are born, they'll be like, you can do anything in this world you want. I never had that. You never had that. We were like, you're a female, you're a girl, like you are a girl was actually said several times during the day, right? Like every day in and day out. And my mom would say that to me. And it's nothing like it's not my mom's fault. That's the best that she was taught. And also in our culture, like when I was growing up, the biggest job that my parents had was to keep their girls safe, because especially in the north there is so much violence against women, especially young girls, like the entire rape culture and everything, like especially in the north, it is so sick. Like my parents' biggest job was just to keep us safe. So from a very young age, me and my sister were taught to never stand out, to never speak up, to always keep our head down, work hard, and just keep pushing through. Like New Zealand's been very kind. I feel. I mean, there are always like subtle things that happen. I again also because my experiences are so severe, I think my radar for these things is usually very high. So often, even at work, there are things that no one will notice. That's a subtle patriarchal thing to do, but I will always notice it. And majority of those times, it's guys from my culture that actually do it. It's not Kiwi men who are doing it. It's Indian men, it's Pakistani men who are doing it. So yeah.
One thing which you just told was really apt, like you just mentioned about how you had this a constant reinforcement that you don't speak loud, you behave in a certain way because it's not safe for you, right? Literally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's not
even I
safe.
grew up in the same way, like you can't speak loud, you
Hmm.
can't laugh loud.
Yeah.
When you're walking, you should walk in a specific way. So we grew up with all those restrictions, right? So even for me, right, say for instance, recently I was sitting in a meeting, and there were a bunch of men who were talking, and I was just waiting for my opportunity to speak. But I had no other choice but to really raise my voice to just barge into the conversation to make my point.
Mm,
Uh, but that's very unnatural for me. That
yeah.
doesn't come out naturally for me, right?
Mm,
Whereas this is just our upbringing. This is how we
yeah.
are. But say, for instance, this behavior, the same behavior, can be just seen as being lacking confidence, for
Mm,
instance, right?
yeah.
But it's actually nothing that, it's not
Yeah.
about confidence, it's about certain behaviors that
Mm,
we grew up with. We don't raise our voice, we don't interrupt conversations. And
yeah.
another important characteristics was, like, if you don't really know 100% of everything, you don't say that you know, right?
Mm. Oh,
That
yeah.
again comes from that culture. I don't know if it's very specifically for women, but I just seem to really say, yes, I know things only if I'm 100%
Mm,
confident about it. And once again, this can also have a huge impact
mm,
when I'm applying for a job, like starting from the job description to going and attending interviews. Like, am I able to interrupt a conversation to prove a point?
mm,
Or am I able to confidently say that I know a subject thoroughly? Because you always feel that you cannot know 100% of everything, so you don't know. But it's
yeah.
not about saying that, okay, I know a little bit of it and I know
Mm,
it, right?
yeah. Like speaking to confidence, right? Um, it takes a lot for me. I wasn't born like this. I was the opposite. I was almost the opposite of this when I arrived in New Zealand. I'm pretty sure a lot of my colleagues from, like, ex-colleagues from Westpac or from my time early years at ANZ, if they see this podcast, they'll be like, "Oh my gosh, Camy has really changed. She has transformed." And I'm like, "Yes, I have, because it has taken a lot of time." So I spent the first 25 years of my life fighting the external patriarchy, because I was born in a highly patriarchal system, and so have you, and so have millions of women from my culture and from other similar cultures. And then the last 10 years in New Zealand, I spent all of that time fighting the internal patriarchy. And that internal patriarchy is what I had internalized for the first 25 years of my life. You know, those voices in my head. Like, even though I was in New Zealand, which is highly progressive and very women friendly, I still couldn't truly benefit from being in such a friendly and progressive environment, especially as a woman, because of my upbringing. So when we say confidence, like, what's the backstory, right? What's your background? Confidence with respect to what? Like, so when you say confidence, for you, it's not just confidence, right? Like, for you, it's not just about building confidence or speaking up. It's also fighting all of that internalized patriarchal versions that are in your head. You have to put we spend so much time fighting the voices in our head, and once we defeat all of that, then we can speak up. So majority of people will never realize it, because that's not their lived experiences. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people will listen to this podcast, and they will, if they're not empathetic people, if they have no interest in learning about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they will just emotionally disconnect from this podcast. But the people who will stay and listen to this podcast and listen to our stories are the ones who can then evolve in their leadership style. So yeah.
What advice would you give to other migrant women of color who want to enter into tech sector in New Zealand?
So I guess one of the first things which I didn't do, because there was no one to tell me, right? Like, no one in my family had even no one in my family, like even an extended family, had ever left India. I was the first one to leave India. So get out of your comfort zone. It is going to be hard. I think it's especially if you are from Indian or South Asian background. As I've already explained, we spend a lot of time fighting those voices in our head. Get, like, as soon, even if you've only been here for 6 months, I would encourage you to get out of your comfort zone. Get out of your comfort zone and go attend all of these meetups and these conferences that happen, right? It's like, find people who look like you, or come from similar backgrounds as you, and then try to connect with those people, go to the meetups that they're speaking at. This is exactly the same advice that I give to my sister. One of my friends, Sophie Chen, I'm not sure if you know her. Sophie Chen, she's just an amazing human. She is the founder of BA Career Group. I spoke at her meetup group earlier this year on migrant career as well. So she had a meetup in Auckland, and I told my sister to go and attend the meetup, and if she gets a chance to say hello to Sophie, she did that. And when she was doing that, she also told Sophie that she's Camy's sister. So Sophie was very excited, and I'm like, but it took my sister so much, like so much hyping up from me, because she was like, oh no, what am I gonna ask? What am I gonna say to Sophie and blah blah blah? And I'm like, no, don't think about anything. Just go say hello. Just go say hello and just tell her this was an amazing meetup. And that's exactly what she did. And just like it was so, I mean, and I like it wasn't surprising for my sister to just kind of like go to see her internally struggling, and I think that's when I say get out of your comfort zone. That is what I mean. Like fight, like in spite of all of those shit voices in your head, still put yourself out there. Go say hello, because for women from our culture, just saying hello is such a big deal, right? Like when I first came to New Zealand, I was just so much in my shell. I wouldn't even say hello or like smile at people in the kitchen. If you're not in my immediate team, if you're a stranger, I would never even look at you and smile at you. Like, so I guess like, but all of those things are things that keep you restricted, right? You don't live in the same culture as your home country now. This is a very different culture. This is a highly progressive culture, and you can do anything over here. So take advantage of that. If you feel like you don't, like if you think like you need to talk it with, then this is where you find people. This is where I think the advice of finding people from your same culture is really, really important. Like you and I can give advice to people from our culture, but we are not very apt to give advice to people from Japan, let's say, right? So I think this is for early migrants, like for migrants who've just arrived in the country, who are trying to build their careers, especially in tech, I always encourage to find people from your culture who are already working in tech. Go connect with them. And I think that's a really good starting place, and you will find so many opportunities just from there. Also, like, don't be afraid to look dumb and stupid, especially when you're asking questions. This is something that I did. I held back because I didn't want it to look dumb and stupid. Like your example earlier, right? You will only say you know something when you 100% know it. And I think that goes back to our preconditioning as young girls, right? So I think now I know so much. Now I am so much wiser and so much more smarter, but I still push myself to ask dumb and stupid questions, because that just, like, that just reinforces that belief that no question is ever dumb question. And if I don't put myself out there, confidence is never going to come. Like like building confidence is a practice. You practice building confidence every day. You put yourself out there, you ask questions, even if it's stupid, and that's how you do it. Yeah, so I think that all of that would be my advice. Also, like, I know a lot of migrants, like, we come from very tough backgrounds, right? Like, adversity is what we have seen. And just like looking back at my dad, I'm just like adversity teaches you so much in your life. So if you can just look at the bright side of it, look at all the good things. Like, I have learned I am so resilient. Like, everyone in my inner circle, in my close friend circle, knows this. Like, I am one of the highly resilient people. And that's just because I have faced so many adversities in my life, and I have fought through all of them. And now I always look back at my own journey, and that's my biggest source of inspiration. So for all the migrants who are coming over here or are planning to move overseas, I'm like, moving from where you come from to a first world country was the hardest thing you could do. From here on, things are going to be easy. This is easy, man. Like, building a career in New Zealand and tech is easy. Beating thousands and thousands of Indians to get that one opportunity at Westpac, was the hardest thing I have done in my life. I already did that, and I did that at the age of 25. So rest of my life, this is nothing. I've already been in the competition. Like India is like billion people, man. Like for every person that leaves India, there are thousands of other people standing behind in line. No, that is exactly true. Like that's how, because I was outsourced, right, through Infosys. That was the culture. Like if I was fall sick, if I couldn't get on my flight, there are hundreds of other people just from Infosys standing in line to to replace me. So I mean, and I hope, and I shared that example not to brag about myself, but just to give people some level of comfort. Like coming from their highly competitive culture and making it here was the hardest thing you have done. And now if you can just be okay with being dumb and stupid and asking some hard questions and putting yourself out there, rest everything is easy.
Yeah, really well said. Hey, and also, I know that you have a conference coming up.
Mm.
Do you want to talk to us a little bit more about the conference? What is the mission? Why another conference? You just organized the NZ Tech Rally, the testing conference.
Testing conference, yes.
Now, what about another conference?
Yeah, so testing conference is kind of like, because I have a QA background, and testing conference was one of the first conferences that I organized back in 2021. So I just organized, me and my co-founders, we organized another edition of testing conference this year. And testing conference for us is just an amazing opportunity to bring all the people who care about quality and about QA across New Zealand together and just celebrate our local tech talent. So I think I just because I'm part of the QA community, I just love bringing the QA community together every year. So which is why I still organize testing conferences. NZ Tech Rally started from like there are so many niche conferences. Like there are conferences on there are conferences for like front end, for mobile development, for API development, for product, for engineering, but there is no conference that brings all aspects of software development and delivery together. So NZ Tech Rally was designed to be a conference where the entire software delivery team can come and can attend the conference together. And because we are bold, I mean, I am bold, and I think that just kind of like I also attract other bold people into my life, especially in my inner circle. So we at NZ Tech Rally, we like being opinionated, and we always love having a theme for our conferences. So this year's theme is resilience of individuals, teams, and organizations in the Aotearoa software industry. And that theme is based on of everything that we have gone through over the last couple of years since COVID, because it has been a hard time. Like for the New Zealand tech sector, it has been a hard time. Personally, I've been very lucky that BNZ renewed my contract for third year in a row. Otherwise, I would be in the market looking for a job amongst hundreds and hundreds of other people, right? So this conference theme was particularly chosen to acknowledge collectively, like to actually give everyone the opportunity to collectively acknowledge that we have been through a lot, but what have we learned from it, and how can we move forward? So this conference is an opportunity for a lot of people to come together and learn from each other what we have gone through and how can we move forward. So a lot of stories around resilience and hope, and some practical strategies that if this happens again, how can we be more resilient next time? So this year's conference is at Takina, Wellington, which is a very cool venue. And we are hoping to host about 600 people this year. That will be our biggest conference, one of the biggest conferences that we've ever hosted. It will be my fourth conference. It will be very cool. So the early bird tickets for NZ Tech Rally conference are now available. I think they are at $170, but they're limited only. So if people are interested, they can check us out at nztechrally.co.nz. We're also on LinkedIn, and it's called NZ Tech Rally. And that's the conference. So the conference is on 22nd of November. I believe that's a Friday. Yeah, it is at Wellington, and I would strongly encourage for everyone to ask their employers to buy their tickets, because companies should be investing in their employees' personal development, right? Yeah. just to add on to that, kind of like, so we design our, because our conferences, NZ Tech Rally is an inclusive platform. So the way we design our conferences are, you will see a very large representation in terms of speakers. We always aim for at least 50% female speakers, and even in that 50% female speakers or 50% remaining male speakers, we go for the diversity in terms of like ethnic groups and racial groups. So we almost always have women of color speakers, which is kind of like my own personal agenda, sort of like I always push for like more women of color representation. But also like we are also highly inclusive. This year at NZ Testing Conference, we had NZSL interpreters who were speaking in, like, who were kind of like using the sign language from the stage. We also had live captions on one of the screens, which is like a lot of people don't realize, right? Like live captions are not only for deaf people, they're also for people like me. English is not my first language. There are still so many languages in English the words in English that I can't understand. So many Kiwis speak so fast. So many other cultures, like in native English speaking cultures, have such strong English accents that we cannot understand it. So by providing live captions in our conferences, we are actually helping all of the migrants out, like all of the non-native English speaking people out as well. So like these are all the kind of things that we actually care about, and we try to design a conference that, like caters for everyone, is inclusive for everyone. So yeah.
Great, great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Best wishes for your conference. I don't really understand how you manage organize multiple conferences in a year with a contracting role and with your passion to serve the community. It's just absolutely amazing, Camy.
Thanks, Meera. It is a lot of hard work, and I do struggle. There's a lot going on at home as well. But I guess, yeah, that's what life is. You have to prioritize and keep going.
Yeah. Any final messages for our listeners?
So I guess, like, when I was preparing for this interview, I tried digging deep into like what is the purpose of this interview. So I came up with two things, and I would like to share those two things. So the first purpose of this interview is, for me at least, doing this interview with you, is sharing my story so that we can empower women from Indian and South Asian background. Because people look at me now and people almost think that I'm white or I'm Kiwi and I was born this way. No, I wasn't. So if you listen to this entire podcast, now you know I'm very Indian. I come from a very poor Indian background. And it's taken a lot of hard work to be who I am today. And I still have so much to go. So hopefully my story inspires people from my background. Like that is my hope. And this is why role models are so important, because I think role models show us what we can do, because it's like you can't be what you can't see. But if you can see, you can be that. So if someone can see me and be like, oh my gosh, Camy is so amazing, I want to be like Camy. Like, this is why I wanted to share my story, right? And again, I mean, of course, and I say that with no ego attached. So yeah, just to empower women from my culture. The number of opportunities, like you've already done the hard part. You've already landed yourself in New Zealand, live from here onwards. And the number of opportunities you have for you now are so many, given if you were still in India, right? So like, why hold back now? Just go for it. And the second purpose was, I hope sharing my story. I hope a lot of people who do not have same background as us also bother listening to my experience, so that they can raise their awareness on the systemic issues, the very incredibly hard lives that women from my culture have lived through, and the fact that we are still here. So that next time when you look at that CV from an Indian female who grew up in India, or from a Syrian female, or someone or a Black person who grew up in Africa, you at least have some context of whether the playing field is quite level or not. So for me, I think it like DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion is about increasing your level of awareness, right? Especially if you come from a privileged section of society, and podcasts like these, books on D&I, this is how you open yourself to other people's experiences, especially people from radically different background as you. You sit through those podcast episodes and you listen to, and you try to understand what they're talking about, and that's how you increase your awareness. So I really hope, and I really hope, like that thing that we discussed, like just another third point would be, when people do talk about D&I hope it's not just a tick box checking exercise. Like, I am sick of hearing we have 46%, 50% women employees. No, I want to know more. Give me more. How many female engineering managers do you have? How many Maori Pacifica people do you have? How many gender diverse individuals do you have in your senior leadership? So I hope the work can be done from like the entire collective does their work, so that we don't have to keep asking for things like these. Yeah, I think those are my parting words. That was a long spiel.
No, but it was good. It was really good. Thank you so much, Camy, for joining us. Really loved your spirits and enthusiasm and your stories. It was just so refreshing to hear your story, and also how willing you were to share your background and experiences and your vulnerable situations as well. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Meena. And I was saying at the start of this podcast, like, just keep doing what you're doing. Like, things like these just like inspired me more. There is so much more work to be done, especially for people in our community. It's like for me, it is a multi-pronged approach. I need to do the work to raise my own community, raise my own people, and then everyone else just needs to do their work. But then there is also that awareness work that other people outside our community need to do to understand our experiences. And I think your podcast is definitely serving both of those purposes. So hats off to you, and thank you so much for just giving me the opportunity to share my story. I really appreciate it, and just keep doing the amazing work you're doing.